Today on CityCast Boise, it's our winter break, and we're awarding several of our favorite episodes with some classic yearbook superlatives. Back in October, for my very first episode, I sat down with Story Night's Jodi Eichelberger to talk about how our city gives everything, and I mean everything, a standing ovation. At first I thought it was corny, but Jodi brought me around to believing that this is Boise's sweetest local gesture. It's Friday, December 30th, 2022. I'm Emma Arnold, and this is CityCast Boise. Jodi, thank you so much for being here. You're my first ever guest. That's so exciting.
Oh my gosh, that's such an honor. I'm so excited.
I wanted to have you on because you have, performed all over the place and you moved back to Boise, but you got your start here. And I feel like you'll have such a good insight in a lot of this. Like, I think I've told you this story, actually, that one time I was down at the Morrison Center at 10 a.m. with my aunts for a production of Dirty Dancing the musical. And it was, and I think what happens a lot with Boise is because we're a smaller market is like runs of shows like that will start here to like work out some of the kinks. And this show had a lot of kinks and a lot of forgotten lines, a lot of choreography mishaps. Someone got hurt and cried at one point. Like there was so much happening. So many issues with the show. And at the end, what did Boise do? Do I have to tell you at the end of the show? You can tell me.
Yeah, they gave it a standing ovation.
Yes, they did. Of course they did. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And we have talked about this before, but I just think it's such a funny, sort of like sweet, but also maybe not great thing that Boise does is we standing O everything. And I was just like, can you quickly like give me an example of something you've seen like standing O that you didn't stand or you didn't want to stand? You were kind of like, oh.
Yeah, I mean, I go to productions all over at the Morrison Center, at Boise Contemporary Theater, at Alley Repertory Theater. And, for me, a standing ovation happens when it's not even something I think about. It's an energy that lifts me out of my seat and I can't contain myself. And some of that happens when there are people around you doing that. But yeah, I have definitely been seated and unable to see the stage while the rest of the audience is all standing. Sometimes it's been a touring production. Sometimes it's been a local production. I feel like it makes sense in a way when you're in New York and you have spent maybe $150, $250 on your ticket. You almost have to stand to believe in yourself that you made a good choice.
I spent $200. Yay!
I spent $200
I feel great about it.
It's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I get to stand and give it a standing ovation. But recently, like some of the productions that I have stood for, Alley Rep did a production of The Royale, which was about this African-American boxer. That was their last show in the last spring. And it was an example of where I was just so taken over by the energy of the play, but also aware that it was all done locally. They did bring an actor in from Chicago, but one of the main actors was a local actor, Dakota Brown, who was amazing, and the role was incredible. But there's certainly been other ones where the production didn't seem extraordinary. And I think people feel that they're supporting it by standing and giving an ovation. But I also wonder if actually it's good for our local companies if we don't tell them, wow, this is the best thing you've ever done. It's okay to enjoy it and support it, but also let the company know, we've seen you do better work. We think you can do better work. There's probably more ways that
improve.
You can, room to grow, room to improve. So it is interesting. I mean, we don't have the market on it. I mean, in London, it's very common to have 3 standing ovations.
Really? So it's not just like a Boise. It's not just a Boise thing. It isn't just
Boise, but
it's
the way
us in London.
Well, yes, it's Boise and the West End in London. But I don't know if you just heard this news story from Cannes. There's that new movie with Colin Firth set in somewhere in the British Isles, but they had an 18-minute standing ovation.
Wow.
I can't even imagine how you accomplish that, how you can stand and clap for 18 minutes.
Yeah. And you bring up an interesting point because, I've always been of kind of two minds about it, a little torn, because I, like you, I've performed all over the place. And when a lot of times when friends of mine who are musicians or comedians will come through, they're so astounded by how gracious and generous the Boise crowds are. And they're always like, I got a standing ovation. And I don't quite have the heart to be like, well, so did the belly dancing show I saw at 2 p.m. at Fred Meyer, so just maybe, maybe cool it. But I also feel like you said, like, on the one hand, I feel like this can be such an amazing incubator for budding talent and can also be like a place really talented people like you come back to or even stay, like Dakota Brown, like people stay here because of the crowds. That's a big part of the reason is. And so, I have wonderful audiences. I love to perform here. The people are so fun, so gracious. The Story Night crowds were always some of my favorite crowds, just there for anything, so supportive. I would always tell people when you were telling a story for Story Night that the crowd was like, go ahead, sweetie. They were just so on your team.
They're on your side.
Yeah. And I think that's so important for new performers and tired old hacks like me, like either way, it's like very, very helpful. But at the same time, I think, like you said, like, it doesn't exactly push a person to become a better performer. And also, I know from my own experience and from other people who, after you start performing in other places other than Boise, you can get a real slap in the face for as far as like where you're really at as a performer, because you can be a big fish in a small pond here kind of forever. But then the second you go to a larger city and they're expecting like, New York level, they'll like a lot of times you can kind of get a little dressed down by a crowd and maybe expecting that like super positive energy.
Yeah, we had a resident at our program at Cyril's Place who was from Croatia. And I sent her to a program. It was a literary program in Boise. And afterwards I was like, so how was it? She's like, oh, Jodi, everything was amazing. Everything was awesome, except it was not.
What was the not? I'm so curious. What was the not?
Well, I think what she was saying is that people were sharing their reading and everyone's comments were like, wow, that was incredible. That was so awesome. I mean, it's really amazing. And so all the comments were awesome, awesome, awesome. But her viewpoint was that, no, there was work to do. It wasn't awesome. There were things that needed to be developed and improved. And so it was really interesting to get her perspective of that community as well. And that's not actually helpful. It is enthusiastic and it is supportive in a way, but not necessarily helpful to someone developing their craft.
Yeah, that's you might not have been back when this happened, but there was a Portland art critic who moved here. This was, 10 years ago, maybe, who moved here and he continued writing critiques of art here as though he was still in Portland. And I think he worked for The Weekly and he wrote some articles for The Statesman and a few other things, but he got run out of town. I mean, people hated him. They were livid that he was giving really fair and sort of honest and like sometimes kind of brutal feedback and he went to everything. He went to, gallery shows and he went to plays and he came to comedy and he would write very honest reviews of things. And Boise he was not having it. And I was always kind of like, look, I think maybe the way that this person is going about this is a little, brusque, but a lot of what he was saying was like, it was true. It was honest. And I kind of felt like maybe we needed more of that. Like we needed people who were sort of willing to make their friends in the art scene mad in order to be like, no, we could raise the standards on some of this. But yeah, he ended up moving back to Portland because people were like, no, we're not doing that here. Absolutely not.
Is there someone who is fulfilling that role currently? Do we have any critics for entertainment?
I can't think of anyone. Like anybody that I know would go, like you said, go to something, go to a play at BCT and be willing to write up a scathing review that made it so that when they walked into flying everybody turns their heads and is furious. I don't think we do, which is such an interesting point because like there's a Fran Lebowitz quote that I absolutely love. And I just think it's an interesting quote because she says you need a high level of connoisseurship. Or I'm paraphrasing, but it's like a high level of connoisseurship is as important to art as the artist. And I don't know, do you think that's true? Do you agree with that sentiment?
It's a little tricky because I know that there are lots of performers who refuse to read any critiques or reviews. Like they don't want that to be part of their experience. They don't want it to affect the continuation of their run. I mean, that's a little different when you're doing a show that runs for 6 months or years than it is when you have a show in Boise that lasts 2 weeks or 3 weeks. But yeah, I think it's helpful. I think it helps me get the pulse of the community. And I think that as a performer doing work in live theater or even dance or opera, whatever it is nice to know that there's something about your performance that continues past when the audience leaves the theater, that there's a dialogue about it. And we're not privy to people's private conversations. So our only way of experiencing a dialogue about an art event that happens in town is really through critics and, not the previews that sometimes happen in journalism where it's like, hey, this person's coming to do this show, or we've got 2 of the actors from Idaho Shakespeare Festival who are going to tell us about their roles. I'm talking about after the show. What impact did it have? How did the company that did it either strengthen that or weaken it? That's an interesting dialogue to continue to have, which gives importance to the work.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. You plateau, I think, as an artist without critique and feedback and people telling you what it meant to the community, if anything,
Well, and it's a helpful way of having a different view of it, because when you're inside the work, it's a very, tunnel vision. I started the day with a really amazing view of our city today. I took a hot air balloon ride over the valley.
That's amazing.
From Meridian to Star, it was my route because we had a north-south wind today. But it's that perspective, and that can be part of that when you get someone's view from another viewpoint. To me, of course, all great wisdom comes from the Muppets. So what I am reminded of is I think I've misremembered it actually, but being in the hot air balloon, I was remembering Gonzo being in a balloon, which I'm not sure. And he had this song that was, "Is there a song there? Do I belong there?" And for both of us, I think being in this community, that's a question that we ask: is there a song here? Is something singing in our entertainment community here that is creating something more than we can describe, something that we feel, something that builds on itself? And then also, do we belong here? I think we have to keep asking ourselves that question. But it certainly, the community is, I was talking about this the other day, about how the difference between, for instance, performing in New York and performing in Boise is my much greater awareness of community, and that the relationship between me and the audience doesn't necessarily end when the show's over, because these are people that, like you said, how the critic couldn't really survive, because it's people that you see at Flying M, it's people that you see on the Greenbelt. And, if you gave a really bad performance, those people may avoid looking at you as you walk by.
Yeah, they're like, if you bomb, they're like, well, we still like you as a person, which is I feel like maybe that's what's behind a lot of the standing ovations Boise gives, is like, hey, that was a little rough, but we're still friends.
We're still friends. Yeah. I still love you.
I still love you.
I support you in whatever you do.
Not your best. 18 minutes just clapping. Not your best.
18 minutes. I feel like comedy it's not really built in for standing ovations as much, is it? I mean,
No, you occasionally see it at Story Night. I've been there for a few standing ovations. What's your favorite standing ovation that's happened at Story Night? Or favorites?
Well, one of them was Shadi Ismail, who's a member of our community who came here as a refugee. And I always thought that storytelling was really about your word craft. How well do you put your sentences together? What word choices do you use? At the time when he shared his story about coming here, his English was not at a high level. And so he had to use really basic words. His story was riveting. And the audience leapt to their feet afterwards. It was absolutely incredible. It was about him feeling like he had run from this place of hate and that Boise was a place of love, that he could be who he was and live in this community. He's still here. They actually made a Apple Plus movie series based on his story, part of a series, which was pretty interesting.
Well, that's one thing I love about Story Night so much is it's not always so much about the craft. It's about the vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I have been to a lot of other and participated in a lot of other storytelling, programs, The Moth and things like that all over the country. And I will say Boise is a place I have seen the most vulnerable stories happen, because I think in bigger cities, like I've done The Moth in New York, and people are competing for a book deal when they do The Moth. Like the feel of it is like, this is going to land me a spot on NPR, but Boise, people are really just getting up and just spilling their guts in a beautiful, vulnerable way.
And that's where I first saw you. I had literally been in Boise, I think, for 3 days when I went over to see a Story late night that you were hosting. And I had just come from New York, had just been at a Moth event probably 2 or 3 weeks before. And that contrast was huge. Because just as you said, like when I was at the Moth, you'd see people standing in a corner muttering to themselves, like going through their story because they wanted it to be, word perfect, and they figured it out exactly how they were going to deliver it. They weren't really responding to the audience because it was all premeditated and very tightly focused. And the show here, as you said, it's just the vulnerability, the stakes are lower, but somehow the power is much higher, which is really fascinating.
Well, talking to you, I was at the beginning of this, I feel like I was leaning more towards like, we got to stop standing ovationing everything. We got to stop it, Boise. But hearing you talk about that makes me just feel like, no, we're so sweet. And you know what? Boise keeps standing up for everything. And you know what? I'll do it too. So thank you, Jodi, so much for being my very first guest. This was super fun. And
yes.
I'm going to keep standing up for everything that you do because it's the best. And you're the best. And I love you so much.
I love you. And I should have put out there that, of course, I still expect standing ovations for the things that I'm in.
Yeah, obviously.
Like, don't
for
sit
the listeners.
down for me.
For the listeners, clearly, I mean, be discerning, but Jodi and I still expect you to stand up for us. So be reasonable. That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. We'll be back from our holiday break January 3rd with your resolutions and predictions for 2023. Until then, we miss you. We love you. Happy New Year.